Okay, we're going to jump right in. Thanks, JJ. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be with you today. Thank you, JJ, for inviting me to present on this month's webinar. I saw the registration list, and I know that there are a few familiar names on here. So hello to you that I have met before, and welcome to those of you that may be new or it may be the first time that you joined one of our webinars. We're happy to have you. We have titled the presentation of this month's webinar as Employee Handbooks, Creating Better Alignment and Protection for Your Business, which is a mouthful. Luckily, I don't have to say it too many times, but I'm hoping that today this information can help you both align your policies with how you operate, as well as it will help to protect your business. I know that as business owners or business leaders, protecting your business and your assets is one of your most important priorities. So I think this webinar will help you with that as well. So thanks again for taking time out of your day to join us. All right, let's run through the agenda. We're going to talk about the purpose of the handbook. So why do we even have one? Then we'll talk about how it helps both the employee and how it protects the employer. We'll also talk about, we'll touch on employment at will, what that is, why it's important, and why it's important for that language to be included in your handbook. And then we'll cover common policies. So for example, what types of policies does every handbook generally include? And then what are some of those not so common policies that are going to be things that are maybe more custom to your industry or your business? Then we'll touch on handbook adherence and what that means for you. How does it impact you if you have a handbook but you don't follow it? And then finally, some handbook updates. How often should we update our handbook and so forth? So let's jump in. All right, this is a key slide because if you don't understand the purpose of a handbook, there's really no motivation to create one, right? So walking away from this webinar today, I'm hoping that you can see how having a solid employee handbook can provide that extra layer of legal protection. If you do have a handbook, you probably already know the benefits of having one, but maybe you joined today because you want to make sure that it includes all the things that are really important to have housed in that document. It also provides accurate information about your business, especially as you grow, right? So new hires may not get 100% of their policy information directly from you. So rather than allowing another employee to fill in those blanks for a new hire, a handbook can ensure that they're getting correct information directly from the source. Also, you can include things like your company mission, your values, your company story. The handbook is a great place to reinforce those things. Your handbook is a consistent message to everyone who reads it. So there's not a lot of room for interpretation in the written word. So all employees in your company are receiving the same message and it's being interpreted the same way. Your handbook helps employees to understand how they'll be governed at work. What's going to get me in trouble? What am I okay with? It also sets clear expectations for you. So if you have a policy in a handbook and the employee asks a question about that policy, it's great for you to be able to answer it, but you can also refer them to that policy to see it in writing. We talked already about that extra layer of legal protection. It's nice when you can provide a policy and a policy acknowledgement related to any issue that may come up. So employers have been using employee handbooks in legal cases to protect themselves for years. And typically it's in a good way, right? They're using their handbook to show a judge, a jury, a plaintiff's attorney, what they've done to make sure that employees understand and are aware of how their company is run and how their policies and practices are governed. Finally, this written document can help improve new hire process because you won't feel as though you have to cover everything verbally. Your handbook can cover a lot of information for you. According to Gusto, 87% of small businesses between 10 and 200 employees have an employee handbook. And that's a pretty big percentage, right? And what that tells me is that most employers understand how important it is to have an employee handbook. Once you kind of extend your well, when it comes to an employee handbook, company size really doesn't matter. Most HR professionals agree that a handbook can be just as beneficial for a small handbook of a small handful of associates as it is for a larger business. And once you kind of extend your business past the owner and his wife, or one person doing everything, and you officially hire someone to come on payroll, that's when you really should have some governance in place, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. Let's talk about our employees for a minute. So how can your handbook help your employees? Well, it can help both employees as a group, and I think it can also help individual employees when they have questions. I mentioned this earlier, but it can, if you choose, lay out your company mission, vision, and values. If those are important to your culture, then including them in the handbook is a very helpful way to integrate a new employee. This is also an opportunity to tell your company stories. So what do you want employees to know about where you came from and how you started? Some of you know I worked for GE for many years, General Electric. And our company story started with Thomas Edison and the invention of the light bulb. GE started in 1892 in Schenectady, New York, and it used to be called Edison General Electric. That story and the company's growth from those humble beginnings was an important part of the company story. And GE was very proud of that story and how far they'd come. So that story was shared with all new hires and new hire orientation, and it was included as a section in the employee handbook. And I think it helps employees to kind of rally behind your vision a little bit. Now, I know that we have a few folks on today that either own or operate behavioral health facilities. And to many of you, there is a reason you went into that business, right? Many of you have a story about why behavioral health was your life's passion. And so if that's something that you want your employees to know and understand, the employee handbook is a great place to share that information. Also, employment at will language. Now, you might think, well, the employment at will language is really more helpful to the employer, but honestly, it's important for both sides of the employment relationship. The benefit to the employee in the at-will relationship is that they do have the option to leave a job at any time with or without notice. And that language is included in the at-will statement of your handbook. We'll touch on that in just a minute. Your handbook can also outline your office structure, team structure. If you'd like to get that detailed in your handbook, it can include things like your dress code policy, meal and break periods. Who does an employee talk to if they have an issue? Or maybe they've approached a manager about an issue, but the issue doesn't seem to be resolved. What do they do next? And other just internal guidelines and policies that you want your employees to understand. The handbook also promotes equality. As I mentioned before, all policies generally apply to everyone. So everyone's on the same playing field when it comes to the language in the employee handbook. Your handbook should also have information about corrective action, disciplinary management, and especially progressive discipline. It should also have language advising the employee about immediate discharge offenses, such as bringing a weapon to work, or theft, or something like that. If this happens in your company, you want to terminate them immediately, right? That's not tolerated, and we need to take action right away. But having that in your employee handbook and having employees know that there are immediate discharge offenses is really nice, and it's nice to have that comfort knowing that you can make that decision, knowing that it's included in your handbook. Finally, your handbook can answer common questions from employees, especially for those who are maybe even newer to the workforce. I know that when JJ and I were discussing the topic and the content of the presentation, he recalled that earlier in his career, he was somewhat reliant on an employee handbook to refer to regarding how PTO works, how much is he accruing, When can he take it? Who's considered immediate family for a bereavement policy, and other things that an employee might want to know, but they don't necessarily want to ask their manager about. Okay, next, how does it protect you? Those of you that are in an ownership or a leadership position, we're going to talk about how the handbook protects you and what do you get out of it. First, and highly important, is that it covers required federal policies. So there are some policies that as an employer, you are required by federal law to abide by. Some of those include Title VII, equal employment, anti-harassment, FMLA, I-9 employment eligibility, workers' comp. Additionally, many states have state-specific policies that must be adhered to, and your handbook is a great place to house this information and to be able to show at any time that your employees are aware of these policies. Or even if you need a refresher on what a specific state policy is or what your own policy language is, right? I mean, there's always Google, but your handbook would be a first great resource for you to go to if something comes up that you don't recall or don't remember. It's hard to memorize a handbook, so you should refer to it. It also covers other important policies. For example, drug-free workplace. What happens if an employee's in an accident? Safety on the job. Other things like that. These policies, I know, are must-haves in certain industries. We have a client who is a mining company, and their, safety training and safety guidelines of policies are, they have to have that legally in order to run their business. We talked about the at-will language for the employee, but now let's talk about for the employer. The at-will language advises the employee that we can terminate that relationship at any time. You are also, under the at-will arrangement, allowed flexibility to make changes to an employee's job duties, hours, pay rate, PTO. These are all covered under the at-will employment arrangement. And those are all important advantages to the employer under this arrangement. Again, the handbook covers disciplinary management so that as we address issues with employees, we can point to or refer to the handbook or to a specific state policy regarding that discipline. I will tell you, discipline is much harder to administer if we don't have a written policy about how things will be handled. It's too easy for employees to push back on us when we have no proof of what our standard process, practice, or protocol is. So having that in writing is really helpful. Also, including a policy about payroll deductions is really important. Many states have specific policies about what needs to be disclosed to an employee about payroll deductions, especially at the time of final pay. So if you've ever needed to deduct something from an employee's additional, pay, then we need to ensure we have a policy and a signed acknowledgement of that policy so that we know that we're safe to pull that deduction. This could be deductions for equipment like cell phone, iPad, company car, if someone's utilizing a company vehicle, damage to company property. Those types of things could be included in that deductions policy. Just a couple more ways the employee handbook is beneficial to protecting the rights of the employer. We get that signed handbook acknowledgement. The acknowledgement includes basic information about the employee's agreement to adhere to the content in that handbook. Now, sometimes the employee will never read the handbook. I don't know if you guys have had that situation, but they'll still sign the acknowledgement. And just know that I would never recommend that. I don't recommend that to an employee. But if they choose to do that, if they choose to skip that step and acknowledge the handbook, by signing the handbook, the employee is agreeing to the content, and they agree that they understand how their employment relationship will be governed, whether they read it or not. So that, again, is a protection for the employer. By the way, I use those signatures all the time when responding to unemployment claims. Oftentimes when responding, I can quote a policy, I can attach a copy of the policy, I can attach a copy of the employee's acknowledgement to the policy, and that can go, those types of details can go a long way in our case to prove, why the employee was terminated and things like that. And finally, the handbook can be used to protect you in litigation. Now, nothing, including an employee handbook completely prevents litigation, especially if the termination is found to be wrongful termination. But I would say that having a handbook in place, using it, updating it, referring to it, making sure employees know where to find it is a big deterrent to litigation. Unless, of course, you have a handbook that you're not following, and then that could potentially create additional liability, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. All right. A lot of you have heard me talk about at-will employment, right? If you've been on a training call with me, or if you've had, unemployment claims, things like that, most likely we've talked about at-will employment. But I want to make sure you're all familiar with it. I want to do a brief overview of this important labor language, because while many people feel like they understand it, if they don't have a full picture, it's confusing. And that's why it's important for your employees to understand the at-will relationship, and why it's so important for that language to be included in your handbook. First, employment in most states is at will. I believe Montana is the only state that does not abide by an at-will governance. This means that an employer can fire or terminate an at-will employee with or without cause, and with or without notice. Likewise, an at-will employee can quit with or without notice. This labor issue is governed by the specific state labor commission. Most importantly, the greatest misconception about being an at-will employer is that while you can fire anyone at any time for any reason, an employee can still file a wrongful termination lawsuit against you. That's the reason why we talk so much and do so much training on making sure your managers and supervisors know how to document and do corrective action, and and why it's important to have HR included in a termination before it happens. You could get sued. Now that sounds scary, or maybe not what you expected in this at-will employment relationship, because it says, hey, I can terminate anyone at any time for any reason. You can still be sued for that. So that's what we're trying to affect. This next slide, this is actual language from one of our handbooks. And I wanted to give you this so that if you're currently creating a handbook, or you have one and you want to compare this language to what you have, this was created by an employment law attorney, and this or very similar language is included in handbooks that we help our clients prepare. So feel free to screenshot or take a picture, or as JJ mentioned, this will be going out later, so you'll have access to this presentation. But here's what the at-will language says. I understand that the handbook is to be used as a guide to the various policies, benefits, and information pertaining to my employment. This handbook is not a contract of employment, express or implied. The company is an at-will employer, and employment is not offered, contracted, or promised for any specific length of time. Furthermore, I understand that my employment is terminable at the will of either the company or me at any time for any legal reason or no reason, and without notice. So again, it's just an important aspect of owning and operating a company, is understanding at-will language and what that means. All right, the next slide. This is, I'll just touch on this quickly. These are really just some of the common policies that are included in most employee handbooks. So workplace safety, use of equipment. And what I mean on that slide by no expectation of privacy is this is essentially why we even talk about equipment in our handbook. It is important for your employees to know that nothing contained on their computer, the computer that you use for, I'm hearing an
I'm
echo.
hearing an echo.
Okay, there we go. So nothing contained on the equipment that you provide to them is private. As the owner of that equipment, you are the owner of the content of that equipment. So employees should not assume that anything they are doing or have housed in that company-owned equipment is private. So that's important for employees to know, that you have access to everything. Nowadays, everyone needs a social media policy, common policies, PTO, vacation, holidays, how all of that works, mill and break periods. And of course, as an HR personnel, to beat this dead horse, disciplinary action, termination language, and of course, those specific state policies that I mentioned earlier. This slide includes what I would call the not so common handbook policies, but these are the things that, in my experience, should be considered and kind of customized for your handbook. These policies may or may not apply in your specific business, but this is a sample or example of those. But essentially, these are going to be policies that are more customized to you. So a credit card use policy. If you are allowing employees to use a company credit card, your employees should be signing some terms of use of that credit card, something that outlines how the card can and cannot be used. This should be have language about personal use and discipline for the misuse of the card. And I'll just share a recent interaction that I had with a client. A client called me a couple months ago, I think it was in January, and he said that they had an employee that they wanted to let go. And this was the first or second week, I think, in January. And during the conversation, he stated that the employee had been using the company credit card for personal use over the holidays, and he had racked up $4,000 in charges. And he went on to describe that the purchases were like a snowboard and snowboard boots, and things that were clearly not for work. And I was very concerned about this and wanted to dig in more to the situation to learn about what happened. And to be honest, I was super fired up about this. And I was in complete agreement with my client. Yeah, we need to terminate him and we need to recoup those funds. And, we kind of started working down that path. Well, at some point during the discussion, I asked if the employee had signed a terms of use document. And I heard crickets. They were like, no, what is that? And I said, does the employee know that they can't use the card for personal use? And the client said, well, it's a company credit card, so I would think so. I said, has the employee ever been verbally or in writing told that they cannot use it for personal use? And again, it was very quiet. Well, as you can probably figure out, they had not provided the employee a single word of instruction on how the card was to be used. So I said, we cannot fire this guy. We need more information. And so I helped them to prepare, the interview questions to kind of start the interactive process to say, hey, we've noticed some charges, and can you tell us about that? And within a minute of them bringing this issue up with him, he was shocked. This guy was in his early 20s and was in kind of a new, I won't call him a manager, but kind of grooming to be a manager position, kind of a quasi manager. And he had never had his own credit card. And he had no idea that the company credit card could not be used for personal use. No one had talked to him about it. They just gave him a card and said, here's your company credit card. So when it was addressed with him, he was like, I will pay it all back today. Like, I love my job. Please don't fire me. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. So moral of the story, the employee is still employed and the company has a brand new terms of use agreement in place effective mid-January for those employees who have a company credit card. Next policy, the alcohol policy. Did you know that some companies allow alcohol in the workplace? We have a client that has a bar in their office, And oftentimes after work, employees will stay around and they'll bring clients in and they'll have a few drinks, and that's their culture. That's just part of their culture. So they have a policy that governs that. But most employers don't allow alcohol. So that's also a very important policy to include in your handbook, to be very clear that we do not allow alcohol and no alcohol is to be consumed during work hours. If you have employees that drive company cars or use vehicles for work, we need to make sure that your handbook includes language about that, including you can't text and drive, those types of things. If you're a restaurant and you offer meal discounts for your employees, the policy should be written in and included and acknowledged as part of your handbook. Then the last two policies are especially important for my behavioral health friends out there. And you probably already heard me talk about this. This is a non-fraternization policy, advising employees that they cannot have relationships with your clients. In my years of providing services to behavioral health industries, this is probably the most common employee issue I see. These boundary issues between employees and clients can be very dangerous and very costly, and we want to be very careful about that. Also, a code of conduct policy for any organization is very helpful. But again, in behavioral health, this can be super important and sticky if you've had to deal with a conduct issue with an employee. I'm just going to touch a little more on non-fraternization, and this is because I know we do have a lot of clients in the behavioral health world. This, again, is just a quick highlight of the type of language that would be included in that non-fraternization policy. I won't get into the details of it, but that last paragraph that you see references that dating relationships between clients and employees are prohibited, and the patient's needs are of most importance in their therapeutic rehabilitation, and the staff is responsible to set proper boundaries in this situation. If you are a behavioral health facility and you would like me to provide you with a copy of this policy, please reach out. It was created for us by an employment law attorney, and it's really good. In fact, even if you do not have a handbook, I would say reach out to me and let me give you this policy, and you roll that out to your employees individually by itself and have that acknowledgement. Let me give this to you, and you know better than I do how important this issue is and how important that employees understand those boundaries. All right, how are we doing here? Okay, another slide, just as important as having a handbook, is the adherence to your handbook. Well, what does that mean? That means that in most every case that comes up, you need to follow the language in your employee handbook. If you are not following your handbook and you have an issue with an employee, the handbook can be used against you. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you have an employee who you are terming for cause. Well, let's say, first of all, let's say that your handbook says at the time of termination, accrued but unused PTO will be paid out on your final paycheck. And then let's say you have an employee who is termed for cause, and it's theft. So you have evidence that the employee stole some work product from you, or equipment or something like that. And you know, the owner says, this employee stole money from me and there's no way I am paying out that PTO. I get it, right? And I don't blame you. Is there a way to get around it? Yes, but only if it's in your handbook. If you don't include their PTO as out, if you don't follow your PTO as outlined in the policy, the employee could use that language against you, right? They can use that with the wage and hour division to say, hey, their policy says they pay out PTO and they didn't pay out PTO. We're going to have an investigation and work and all of that kind of stuff. So in a case like this, we would want your handbook policy language to say something like, accrued but unused PTO will be paid out at the time of termination for voluntary resignation, in cases of termination for cause, accrued PTO will not be paid out. So in this example, you're still following your policy, but the policy allows you to discriminate against those who are termed for cause. All right, we're getting close, guys. Thanks for hanging with me. I recommend that handbooks are reviewed and updated at least once a year. Doing so on a more frequent basis than that can sometimes become confusing for employees, and it can create version control issues. So we used to have a client who I think she called me to update her handbook every 2 weeks, and it was out of control. So we had to, change that process a little bit. So I would say a review of it once a year, editing and updating needed changes at that time is a really good approach. Having said that, let's say you have your handbook, it's been 6 months, but something major happens in your business. There's a major policy that needs to be added or significantly changed. In that case, update it on a basis that makes sense for you. Whatever time frame works for you and works best for your business, that's the way to manage it. Just don't file it away and let it, accumulate dust over the years. Keep it up to date, and that provides the highest level of legal protection. So that's it for me. You survived. Way to go, guys. JJ, do we have any questions that came in?
Don't have any questions. I actually kind of have one.
Okay.
Unless somebody else has one, I want to cut anybody off that may be waiting. On the fraternization policy, I know we touched on that in particular with facilities, and you have those relations with clients, patients, but couldn't that also apply to just relationships in general inside the office, and or anything that encompasses a relationship at the workplace that maybe should be used by any business, or is that overdoing it?
Well, no, I think that's probably going to be more along the lines of, it depends on how your company wants to handle that. I met my husband at work, I dated him at work. So I like that policy, right? I like the fact that I was able to do that and that wasn't prohibited at GE. But I would say that there are policies related to the reporting relationship at work between two employees that are dating. Now, can you have a policy that says employees can't date? Yes. Would I recommend it? I don't know. We'd have to talk about why that's so important. Those are nuanced questions that we kind of would consult on and decide what's the best way to handle that in your organization. Does that kind of answer your question, JJ?
Yeah, it was just kind of a curiosity I had about it.
Yeah. Anything else?
I have a question about if there is recommended language that says something to the effect of maybe updated at any time, and
yes.
And that the new provision yada yada
is in place whether or not the employee knows about it. Yes, that's included in the handbook acknowledgement. Yep.
Okay, very good. And then my other question is, we're in I don't think it's unique, but it might be different to this group here, where we've got two sets of two kind of pools of people. We have staff, and then we have 1099s or real estate brokerage. And so our staff is a very small pool, but we are in interaction with 1099 who are affiliated licenses or with our brokerage, 100 some odd people or more. I'm not concerned about the fraternization thing. And in the agent's independent contractor agreement, we have some addenda that talk about harassment at work, that talk about proper practices on premises and things like that. And I wonder if you have any guidance for navigating. I'm not even sure what my question is, but I've got 100, 200 people who aren't governed by this, who come and go, who are not covered by this handbook. If you have any recommendations or additions to their independent contractor agreement.
I mean, I haven't seen their agreement. What I would say is, you can send it over. We can have Ditto take a look at it if you want him to look at it real
Okay.
quick, and we can see, if there's any recommendations that we have that we would add. But I think the two that obviously come off the top of my head are harassment and, discrimination, EEO type of language, just to make sure that everyone is treated properly, right? Respected and treated properly. Because you don't want an employee to come to you and say, hey, this 1099 contractor has been, harassing me and pressing me for dating or something like that. And we have no rule that says they can't do that. So, I would
We have
say
no
that
rule that says the 1099 can't do that, or the
and
employee
the employee
can't
can't
do
do
that,
that.
or what's
Right. Yes. So
right,
that language
right.
should be in both places.
And then I have 1099s who hire their own employees. What is the perceived relationship with the brokerage, right? Like, what do they presume certain protections from the brokerage?
No, not if
I
they're
don't know.
hired by
I'm just throwing this
not
stuff
if
out
they're
there.
hired by the
Yeah.
independent contractor, because we have to be really
Right.
careful about this. And I know you understand the relationship, Dina, but they're not employees, so we don't have any responsibility for them
Right.
or their employees. So they have to ensure that with their employees are held responsible for the same things under that contract, I would think.
Right. Right.
And Shane asked a question. He says, would you recommend combining a employee training manual with the policy manual, or is it better to keep them separate?
So is this related to things like how employees are to handle customers and patients and students and things like that? I mean, we have clients that have done it both ways. We have clients who have two handbooks. One is for how their employees interact with their patients or staff, or not staff, patients or students or clients, whatever you call them. And then we have how employees interact with other employees and management. I think it's okay either way, as long as it's clear what we're addressing. You could have a combined handbook that has language about both, but I would probably recommend some sort of separation or something like that in the handbook, where it would say these policies are related to employees and your governance of how you behave, and these policies are related to our patients and how you handle and interact with them. It's really more of a culture thing. What do you want to do? But either way, it's fine. I'm going to put up I think most of you probably have my contact information, but let me get rid of that. But there it is. And I'm, of course, happy to talk to any of you at any time. I'm so glad you joined us today. And we went a little bit over, but I think we started a little bit late. So if there's no other questions, we're going to sign off.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Appreciate you joining us.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.